Hello, everyone. There's still more people zooming in, but we'll get started with our program. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Lauren Kuby. I manage events for the Global Institute of Sustainability Innovation, and the Swette Center for Sustainable Food Systems is within that institute. It's my honor to introduce our moderator, ASU's Kathleen Merrigan. Kathleen is the director of ASU's Swette Center for Sustainable Food Systems, and from 2009 to 2013, she served as Deputy Secretary and Chief Operating Officer of the United States Department of Agriculture, where she led efforts to support local food systems. She's known for authoring the law establishing national standards for organic food and the federal definition of sustainable agriculture. Kathleen, thank you for moderating today.
Hey, it's always a pleasure. Thank you, Lauren. And everybody, it is such a pleasure for me to welcome today's speaker. So Richard Munson, you may have read something he's written before because he's written quite a bit. He's an author of several books, including most recently, Telsa, Inventor of the Modern. He's also written a biography of Jacques Cousteau, one of my heroes when I was growing up, a history of electricity, a behind the scenes look at how congressional appropriators spend taxpayer money. You heard about making sausage, right? His recent book, Tech to Table, 25 Innovators, Reimagining Food, is the focus of our discussion today. So Dick hails from Chicago. He's worked on environmental, clean energy issues at both nonprofits, universities, in the private sector, and on Capitol Hill. So a lot of different vantage points. Before we begin, let me remind you all that you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. We'll ask that you put them into the chat. And Lauren is going to be moderating those questions and feeding them to me. Of course, I have some of my own questions, prerogative of the moderator. But we're so excited, Dick, to have you here. And thank you so much for bringing your brilliant new book to our campus.
Well, thank you very much for your kind, both introduction as well as invitation. I must say, noting ASU's real impressive work on sustainability and your Professor Merrigan's expertise and experience on these issues. It really is an honor to be with you this afternoon. So thank you. Let me share my screen if I might. Hang on. There we go. As mentioned, Island Press next week is going to be releasing my new book, Tech to Table. I've long been interested in innovators and entrepreneurs, particularly in the clean energy front, but I decided a couple of years ago to focus on agriculture, in part because agriculture is the world's largest industry. It's valued at about $15 trillion each year. And in part, it's because it is our economy's least digitalized, some would say least modernized industries. And in part because it is at the core of so many of our key issues, climate change, immigration, health, social equity. So I will admit up front that it's a little dangerous to talk about food. What we eat is part of our culture, part of our identity. We hold almost religious passions about our diets, and we have heated arguments about our food choices. So please be aware that neither the book nor I even pretend to resolve those debates or to make recommendations about what food you eat. What I am willing to tread on is the state of agriculture, particularly the state of innovation within the food and farm sectors. Let me start by just suggesting there are when it comes to ag, we have two diametrically opposed views. One is of the well-stocked supermarket, which at virtually any time of the year, we expect to choose from a cornucopia of in and out of season fruits and vegetables, as well as an assortment of cereals, meats, dairy products. The supermarket is in many ways a supply chain marvel, even if it was challenged by COVID. And perhaps even a more positive sign of progress associated with agriculture is that food's share of the average American's budget fell by half since 1950, down to only 10%. What that means is that more people can afford food. Yet there's a second set of images in which agriculture is in trouble and causes trouble. Industrialized farming, for instance, according to some calculations, is the single biggest cause of climate change. The livestock sector alone, particularly because of the methane-laden burps that come from 1 billion cows, it emits more, probably far more greenhouse gases than all the cars, trains, boats, and airplanes combined. Plowing exposes farmlands to rain and wind erosion. It leads to the loss of, imagine this, 30 soccer fields of soil every single minute. The clear cutting of forests to make room for more farms, to grow more corn and soybeans, to feed more cattle. It releases greenhouse gases and destroys biodiversity. Irrigating crops sucks up almost 80% of the planet's fresh water, depleting aquifers and acidifying soils. Spraying fertilizers and pesticides exterminates beneficial microbes and shrinks the land's fertility. And meanwhile, the runoff of those chemicals causes 70% of US water pollution, poisons private wells, and forms dead zones. Here actually is a picture of Lake Erie, the green scum, basically not allowing any aquatic life to survive. So then we have the issue of animal welfare. In addition to the massive scale of slaughter, chickens, pigs, and cattle spend a lot of their lives in cramped cages or in jammed feedlots. Other huge problems, of course, relate to equity and nutrition. Here are lengthy lines of food pantry, because we're in the third decade of the 21st century, and a shocking 815 million people go hungry, and another 2 billion are overweight or obese. So in the United States alone, 14% of American households lack sufficient food, and the obesity rates reach a staggering 40%. Agriculture's problems are poised, unfortunately, to get worse before they get better. The World Bank finds that providing food security to a growing population will, in their words, entail clearing most of the world's remaining forests, wiping out thousands of species, and releasing enough greenhouse gas emissions to exceed the targets enshrined in the Paris Agreement, even if emissions from all other human activities were entirely eliminated. This damage is sometimes cast as the inevitable cost of feeding almost 10 billion people by the year 2050. That's about 2 billion more than today. That's about adding, one China and a half to our population. In truth, the world's farmers already produce enough protein or calories to nourish 10 billion humans. It's just that not all of those calories go to humans. Indeed, almost 40% is lost as wasted food. Roughly 30% of food feeds cattle and other animals, and 5% is used to brew biofuels and industrial products. Let me suggest two other images associated with agriculture. We have on the left the rolling fields of the Midwest. They could be of Arizona as well. And on the right, you have the sleek glass and steel office parks of Silicon Valley, or Tempe, or any other computerized center. It would seem that there could be no two more different pictures of the American economy, in large part because, as I noted previously, farming is our least digitalized sector. Yet in just the last few years, these two worlds are colliding. They're disrupting an industry as a result known for its conventionalism. Innovators have begun to redefine what it means to farm and even the nature of food. Ag-tech startups have soared 80% annually over the last decade. That's a stunning number. And they attracted more than $30 billion of investment last year alone. What these entrepreneurs are doing also is they're supplanting the traditional and longstanding debate between big ag versus return to husbandry advocates. Big ag, of course, or industrial agriculture, focuses on chemicals, irrigation, concentrated feedlot. Reformers, in contrast, are calling for organic and regenerative cultivation, winter cover crops, free-range animals, a variety of other improvements to the soil. Yet neither camp has proven capable of providing sufficient supplies of nutritious food without environmental harm. Malnutrition and pollution, as I discussed previously, they flourish under big ag. And despite decades of appeals and efforts, organic farming accounts for still less than 1% of US croplands, and broad adoption of regenerative practices has failed to materialize. My book argues that largely unrecognized innovators represent a third path, an alternative which advances disruptive technologies that can feed a growing population nutritiously and sustainably. Before meeting a few of these entrepreneurs, let me pose two what I think are pretty obvious questions about this emerging innovation. The first is, why now? We've known for some time about health equity and environmental problems associated with conventional agriculture. So why are so many food and farm entrepreneurs suddenly attracting investment and capturing markets? I think the short answer is that we live in a rather unique era of rapid and stunning technological advances, particularly a confluence of technologies associated with sensors and data collection, associated with leading edge computation and advanced engineering or robotics. Eric Schmidt, who used to be the CEO of Google, calls this combination a super evolution that he claims will fundamentally, irrevocably transform wide-ranging industries. He claims that these innovations allow startups to advance faster than incumbents, resulting in agile, powerful companies. So within just the last couple of decades, this super evolution, this confluence of technology has finally begun to reach the ag sector, spurred by agile entrepreneurs and creative investors seeing opportunities to profit through innovation and to be quite honest, outcompete big ag slow-moving oligopolies. The second, what I think is an obvious question is, should we trust these innovators and new technologies? And I think the answer is not blindly. Green Revolution technologists of the 1950s and 60s certainly increased crop yields and reduced worldwide hunger, but they also poisoned our lands and water. They decreased food diversity. They limited competition. Think also of things like DDT or even margarine. These were considered promising innovations that proved not to be. So I suggest that by using these new technologies, these advanced sensors and this data analysis capabilities, today's entrepreneurs have to be judged strictly by their long-term sustainability. Do they protect the planet? And their equity. Do they provide nutritious food to a growing population? My book profiles 25 food and farm innovators. They come from a variety of backgrounds. Most I found very interesting have not previously been involved with agriculture. I could have chosen a lot of different entrepreneurs and startups, but I hope that the 25 provide a sense of the enormous changes occurring in agriculture and food. I will be the first to admit, unfortunately, that some of the profiled innovators are going to fail or they're going to flounder and that others will prosper. Startups are hard, as Professor Merrigan can note, very hard. But the key is that these new developments are being backed by investors that are putting billion-dollar bets of their own money on food and farm disruptors. So let's meet a few of these people. We'll start with one that you might know, or at least you might have tasted his product. Patrick Brown had what he considered to be his dream job as professor of biochemistry at Stanford, where he helped discover how to block particles such as the AIDS virus from infecting other cells. About 10 years ago, however, he was on a sabbatical and he decided that there were bigger global challenges to tackle. And what he felt was the most important was how we raise and slaughter animals to supply proteins. He concluded that he could write academic papers, he could organize workshops, and yet it would really have little impact on consumers eating less animal-based meat. So in 2011, he founded Impossible Foods to market what he thought were indistinguishable plant-based substitutes. He had a hunch, he claimed, that heme, that's the iron-rich and oxygen-carrying compound in blood and muscle tissue, as well as in some plant tissues. He felt that heme would be the critical element that would give meat substitutes their protein and meaty flavor. So he spent 5 years analyzing and dissecting a variety of plants containing heme. He began with clover and settled finally on the fermented roots of soybeans, from which he created a plant-based burger that offers, at least according to some food critics, a bloody red meat-like appearance and texture that turns into a tasty grayish brown when cooked. Last year, Impossible Burger sold at more than 17,000 retail outlets, including the Burger King and White Castle chains. It's still a niche market compared to the $176 billion big beef industry, but sales of plant-based foods are growing at an annualized rate of 28%, and UBS, the Swiss-based bank, predicts that plant-based sales will soar from about $5 billion to $85 billion by the end of this decade. That would make it about half the size of what today is the big beef industry. Brown certainly has his critics and his skeptics, but he argues that his innovative technologies produces food that consumers prefer, that are more nutritious, that reduce animal cruelty. And he also boasts that making meats from plants emits about 80% less greenhouse gases than making a burger from cattle. He claims, and I quote him here, he says, "If we succeed in our environmental mission, we will be the biggest, most impactful business in history." I should point out, like most aggressive entrepreneurs that I had the pleasure of meeting or interviewing, Brown is not particularly modest. Another innovator trying to take the slaughter and pollution out of meat is Uma Valete, who came to the United States from India on a cardiology residency at the Mayo Clinic, where he used stem cells to repair muscle tissue that was damaged by heart attacks. He had long been concerned about animal cruelty and contamination at slaughterhouses, so he slowly realized that he could use those same stem cells to grow animal muscle tissue, or also known as meat. So he concluded that if, and this is his quote, "If I continued as a cardiologist, I might save a few thousand lives over the next 30 years. But if I am successful in helping to change the way meat is made, I can positively impact billions of human lives and trillions of animal lives." So in 2015, he founded Memphis Meats, which has recently been named Upside Foods. And rather than focus on plants, as does Patrick Brown, Valete extracts some cells painlessly from an animal, inserts them into a growth potion of nutrients, salts, and acidic buffers. And the cells multiply in things like these bioreactors that look and act a lot like fermentation tanks within a beer brewery. He admits that some people will think it's weird, his word, to eat cell-cultured burgers or chicken nuggets. Yet he argues that it's even weirder to eat slaughtered animals and fecal contaminated meats. And he predicts that eaters will embrace the new offerings once they experience their meaty tastes and understand their environmental benefits. He recognizes that his costs must fall and his production capacity must rise. In the last decade, costs have indeed dropped quite dramatically. Israel-based Future Meat Technologies claims that its cultured beef will cost next year as little as $10 a pound. That's still about 20% higher than grass-fed meat, but quite a decline from the $1.2 million per pound that was paid for the first cell-based patty that was introduced just 8 years ago. In his quest to transform animal farming, Valete has attracted millions of dollars from Bill Gates, Richard Branson, and other venture capitalists. So let's meet a few more innovators, but I'll do this a little more quickly. Diane Wu and Purnima Paraswaran, they met in graduate school, also at Stanford, and formed Trace Genomics in 2015. They offer DNA kits for soils. These are not unlike the genetic test kits such as 23andMe that provide insights into a human's ancestry, health, and traits. They analyze just a few grams of soil and then digitalize that vast amount of data about bacteria, viruses, and fungi, and then compare those results through their proprietary algorithms with thousands of other soil samples, and then provide actionable intelligence and guidance to farmers about what seeds to plant in which fields, what nutrients to feed the soil's microbes, and how to avoid diseases that lurk in the dirt. According to the entrepreneurs, they say that making those kinds of decisions for the growing season used to be an art, but we are making it a science. James Rogers, Jenny Du, and Lou Perez, they want to cut food waste in half. They have PhDs in material science and chemistry, and they have devised plant-based coatings that double the shelf life of avocados, oranges, and a variety of other produce. As I noted earlier, we waste about 40% of our food. That is a staggering number. But this food loss problem, according to these innovators, is pretty simple. They say the two leading causes are either water loss or oxidation. That's water evaporating out of the produce or oxygen getting in. So they've created these tasteless, odorless, invisible, edible coatings that consist basically of fatty acids and other organic compounds extracted from the peels and pulp of produce that then they act as a physical barrier to keep the water in and oxygen out. Appeals investors include Oprah Winfrey, but the startup also recently closed another $250 million capital raise, giving it a $2 billion valuation, making it another ag tech unicorn, as billion-dollar companies are called. Irving, this is the comparison of their what happens with their coating if, or compared to what happens without it. Irving Fain, he's the CEO of Bowery. He boasts that his vertical farms in urban warehouses produce 100 times the output of an equivalent size plot of horizontal land. These warehouses are designed or have been designed by the designer of Amazon's massive fulfillment centers. So Bowery's sophisticated sensors and robots provide, he claims, lettuce and bok choy rather than books and jewelry. So they operate without sun or soil. They're hydroponic, LED nurtured, robot dominated systems. They provide targeted nutrients to individual plants. They use no synthetic pesticides or other chemicals. They cut water use by 95% compared to traditional agriculture. Perhaps more significant, their growing season never ends. They can deliver fresh and organic greens to local restaurants and supermarkets throughout the year. Bowery, or Bain in particular, also offers economic development and vigor to inner city restaurants. He asserts quite proudly that high-tech farming provides good paying jobs in formerly abandoned spaces within neglected neighborhoods. Thomas Palomares and Sebastian Boyer, they grew up as friends in France. They both then went to graduate school at MIT and one at Stanford. They offer autonomous machines or robots that detect weeds and then, mimicking a worker with a hoe, basically scoop up the unwanted plants out of by their roots without, and here's the key point, without any poisonous herbicides. The technology within this orange Zamboni looking robot is stunning. Farmwise, their company, takes thousands and thousands of pictures of different weeds and crops at varying stages of development and under divergent growing conditions. With machine learning, it then creates images of what needs to be removed and what needs to be preserved. They then deploy algorithms even more sophisticated than what Google and Facebook use to recognize us. They differentiate between what will become produce and what will become an invasive weed, and then its pluckers remove that unwanted plant from the field, avoiding hours and hours of back-breaking manual labor. Oh, and yes, they also have the benefit that they can operate 24 hours a day. Virginia Emery, she breeds customized bugs. Her favorite shown here are mealworm beetles. What's unique about Virginia is that she's figured out how to do that in an industrial volumes and provide high value proteins and nutrients for poultry and aquaculture farms. And as a result, she avoids the chemicals, erosion, and irrigation associated with growing conventional feed made from corn and soybeans. Her insects, she claims, they take up little space. They live happily when they're jammed together. They survive without light. They breed throughout the year, emit few pollutants. So insects, she claims, are the most sustainable response to agriculture's challenges. And she also adds that their poop, which is called frass, we needed to know, is marketed as organic fertilizer. And then finally, meet Lynette Kushma and Emilio Sepulveda. They are founders of Natural Machines, who make real the replicator that you might remember from Star Trek. That was that fantasy machine that synthesized meals on demand. Their device, they call it a Foodini, is about the size of a microwave. It has stainless steel containers that store natural and fresh ingredients. Its computer stockpiles recipes or downloads them from your smartphone. It even links up to your Fitbit in order to know if your meal or candy bar needs a little extra vitamin D or iron since you just came back from a run. Foodini, it has lots of heating capacity. Blue lasers penetrate the meal. Infrared light browns the surface to the eater specifications. It's used in a variety of different applications. Michelin star chefs are using it to dazzle customers with flower-shaped appetizers. Other restaurants are displaying the device to attract customers who marvel at their food being printed right before their eyes. And KFC is selling chicken nuggets made by Foodinis using cultured cells. According to Kushma, what Foodini is doing is reinventing our culinary ways. I could go on, as you might guess, but let me conclude by noting that there's I think, a quiet revolution that is disrupting the agricultural sector and creating new eating options. The growth of food and farm innovators has been astonishingly rapid. None of the profiled companies that I interviewed existed a single decade ago. No entrepreneur was producing cell-based proteins without slaughtering animals. No firm challenged the horizontal farm and grew plants vertically. None plucked weeds robotically or doubled the shelf life of produce with plant-based coatings. In this era of troubled agriculture, I'm trying to argue that innovators offer hope that we can feed a growing population nutritiously, equitably, and sustainably. So thank you for your interest. Again, I appreciate the invitation and welcome your questions and discussion. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Dick. That was really great. It's a wonderful book. I recommend it to everybody. One of the things that I have a lot of things I'm curious about, and I will let the audience get a chance to ask their questions. Please put them in the Q&A if you have them. They're being monitored and fed to me. But let me just start. You talk about there's big ag, and then you got the organic regenerative people on the other side. Are you worried that some of these startups are going to be acquired by big ag? So you've got this incredible innovation, but I know like a lot of the alternative protein companies in the meat realm have investments from the biggest meat producers on the globe. And I'm just wondering what your thinking is about that.
That is a possibility. There are Blue River Technologies, which also does robots that instead of plucking them out, they actually just pinpoint spray, herbicides on the weeds and get rid of them. It got bought out by John Deere. There's Monsanto bought out the Climate Corporation. So there are examples of where big ag has come in, which is not unusual in any sort of emerging field. I think the thing that I found most intriguing was that most of these entrepreneurs were of the belief that they would outcompete big ag, that the slow-moving oligopolies were not something they wanted to be associated with because they were moving too fast and big ag was just, behind the 8 ball, and they were the future and were fine about competing.
I think some of these big ag companies are setting up their own venture arms, recognizing that they, as these giant entities, are somewhat inert in terms of what they can do. So they're developing that flexibility. Anyhow, we'll see what happens.
Yes.
My next question
Which makes it very exciting, to be quite, as you well know, because you've been associated with, private equity firms. They see real opportunity here and they're putting up a whole lot of money, their own money, and realizing that there's some potential for profit. Yeah.
And actually, I should say that for full disclosure to the audience, I'm a venture partner in a European-based ag tech firm called Astonor and an advisor to a Chicago-based firm called S2G Ventures. So a lot of these companies I'm familiar with, and it's a space that I dabble in on my time off as a university professor. There you go. Okay, so one of the things that you flag right at the beginning of the book and also in your presentation today is a lot of these entrepreneurs are essentially outsiders. Mm-hmm. They didn't grow up on the farm. They haven't been, their careers, the bread and butter of their career hasn't been food and agriculture. And they're coming in and they're being disruptive. And you describe how that can be really a good thing, and I understand that. But I also am old, and I remember back when Calgene introduced the Flavor Saver tomato, which was the first genetically engineered whole food. And by the way, anyone's interested in that, there's a really good book called First Fruit that describes this whole event by one of the innovators, published in 2001 maybe. Anyhow, but the analysis that the innovators had was that the ultimate failure of First Fruit, the genetically engineered tomato, was not so much that it was genetically engineered, but that the innovators didn't understand the industry that they found themselves in. They
Sure.
were outsiders. So
Sure.
are you thinking that there are also some trials and tribulations that outsiders might face, given that they're not in the network, so to speak, because as you say, the industry has been so stuck in so many ways?
Well, I think it varies amongst the entrepreneurs. There are those that are doing, alternative meats that think that they just have the better way and they're going to ram it through. There are others that are, coding seeds or, doing, as I mentioned, these DNA tests. They have, their market is farmers. So they have to figure out how to, advance their new technologies and integrate it into what farmers are used to doing. So those that are, in fact, spraying, pesticides need to figure out how to do it with the equipment that already exists that farmers have. So yes, there's a lot of sensitivity. I think what intrigued me, though, was that there are several farmers, actually quite a few farmers that I interviewed, were of the opinion that they needed outsiders because they needed the dynamism, the investment to revitalize rural communities and to attract and keep their kids on the farm because their kids needed to become, tech savvy so that they wouldn't be bored. So there's weird dynamics that are going on that you point to. It's not a slam dunk that outsiders are going to come in and rule the day by any stretch. There's a huge industry that's out there. But I found it quite optimistic that there were, in fact, outsiders that were thinking differently and bringing their new technologies to the farm, and that would bring benefits to farmers and rural communities.
Yeah. As was just pointed out in the chat, that in order to be disruptive, you have to know what you're disrupting.
Yes,
So you need that fresh view, that vision, that unencumbered way of seeing food and agriculture, and yet you also need to know something about it. Fair enough. So there have been a number of comments in the chat about alternative proteins, the particular meats, the Impossible Foods, the Memphis Meats, the cellular agriculture. And there's phenomenal growth in that field. But the question is about processing. And even in, you talk about Eat Just. And so the question is, how do you substitute or add natural nutrients and vitamins found in chicken and eggs in a plant-based or a lab-based product? I mean, is this process leading to a less natural way of eating and perhaps toward more of a processed way?
Well, one has to step back and think about what is natural and what is processed. You walk down any aisle of any supermarket, I will guarantee you have processed foods in almost everything you see except possibly the produce aisle. And even those have been genetically altered to be the way that they currently are. So, will Eat Just and others with their liquid, eggs made from plants rather than, from chicken eggs, will they succeed? I think we're all, sort of waiting to see what the market does. And, as I mentioned, being a startup, as you well know, it's really hard, but you've got to know your audience. And if you can market something that is perceived as tasty, as well as providing attributes that certain people want, be that not associated with animal slaughter or, have something to do with sustainability, we'll see what the market does. But what I find fascinating is that there are new players who are having some faith in the market and trying to introduce more diversity and options into the food sector.
So one of the questions that we have is just wondering out loud what some of the implications may be for labor with these different innovations. I think back to the Jim Hightower critique of the mechanical harvester in his classic book, Hard Tomatoes, Hard Times, which did of course, it did lead to reduced labor. Of course, we're having a hard time finding labor for the fields, but what are you thinking when you're reviewing all these innovations in terms of workforce issues?
Well, again, it's complex. I mean, you look at these urban vertical, warehouse farms, and you're providing, employment into neglected, low-income neighborhoods. When you substitute these, Zumbini-looking, weeders for crews of usually immigrants that come through the fields, you are probably going to reduce, labor. Those jobs, however, I should point out, are considered some of the most dangerous and low-paying and abusive in, our economy. So, with new technologies, yes, the labor market sort of changes, and we'll have to be, watching carefully as to how it grows. But I think that there are opportunities for new jobs. While in all honesty, some existing jobs are going to get displaced by new technologies.
So early on in your presentation, when you were talking, you're giving a good overview of how agriculture, the sector works now. And one of the questions that came in during that time was asking for your thoughts on the Farm Bill's role in subsidizing the cost of cheap food. And, to what extent is that causing the differentials that we see in price, and where might we be going with these new technologies?
Well, I think the innovators that I spoke with want government to, for the most part, to get out of the way and to stop providing the subsidies to their favorite, welfare queens, is what they refer to, big corn as being, because they get showered with so many, taxpayer resources. So they want a level playing field. I recognize you were certainly at USDA. You understand the politics of this. It is not an easy thing, and there will be people that are arguing that corn is not subsidized and it's important to be, getting the support that it has, et cetera, et cetera. But I guess what I'm finding is that from many of the innovators that I spoke to, they're wanting simply a level playing field, protection for intellectual property rights. They would like to have investments in rural infrastructure, such as 5G, networking, so that rural communities can enjoy some of these new technologies as well as the advances that urban areas do. So I think if anything, innovators would be claiming, government, get out of the way, give us a level playing field.
One of the chapters that one of the companies you highlight is Indigo Ag, and I've been following them with close eye, as a lot of people have, because they have really boomed. And one of the things in the chapter that you wrote, you're really focusing on one of Indigo's product lines, and that is coating seeds with non-GMO microbes. Yep. And it just makes me think, I've been involved in various kinds of microbial pesticide and soil enhancing efforts over my career, and I just don't understand why these markets don't take off. Do you think this is a different time that they're really going to hit payday?
Well, there's some natural reluctance, understandably, on the part of farmers. I mean, they get one shot a year to get the right seeds and pray that the weather will be such that allows those seeds to flourish and not overwhelm the market, but give them decent prices. So there's a natural caution of dealing with something new because it hasn't been proven, and this is their one shot. Do they really want to take that chance? On the other side, I mean, I think you're beginning to see a recognition that there is, in fact, this confluence of technologies, this, evolution of technological advances that are, I think, stunningly new. I mean, it's not to say that we haven't had technological advances before, but you look at the growth of sensors, the growth of, computers to be able to process the vast amount of data that's now coming out of these sensors. This is new. And I think that the offerings, we could find will be more attractive to naturally cautious farmers.
So Dick, you've divided your description of the innovators into 5 sections for the audience to know: proteins, food waste, poisons, nourishing plants, carbon. And several of those sections, you do touch upon soil health. And so one of the questions that has come in is, what are your thoughts regarding soil health and its impact on nutrient density? In produce in particular, but just generally, I suppose.
Well, I mean, we have been horrible to our soils. Plowing reveals them to wind and rain, and we have amazing amounts of erosion. We're, drenching them with, chemical fertilizers and pesticides that kill, beneficial microorganisms. We've got to figure out new ways to do this. And I going back to the point that you made before about, the regenerative, ag advocates who basically are trying to figure out ways to enhance soils, to regenerate them through things like winter cropping and less, plowing, et cetera. I think what these innovators might say is that they share the same goals as the regenerative ag advocates. That's just that they have more faith, I think, in science than they think that the traditional regenerative ag community is at least thought of having.
So, okay. So again, full disclosure, I'm an investor in Appeal Sciences. I love that company, what they're doing, these biofilms to slow down the degradation of produce. That started out with James Rogers and company, started out with money from the Gates Foundation to do that work. And then it became very developed nation, first world, whatever verbiage we want to use, very prosperous economy focus. They just announced in a small round right before the latest that you described, an effort to go back into Africa and really focus on developing solutions for wasted food in Africa. My question to you is, to what extent are all these innovations really the US and Canada and Europe or whatever, prosperous countries, and to what extent are they going to get to other countries where people are really struggling with food insecurity and we see so many desperate people?
Again, I think it varies by the technology. That Zamboni looking orange creature that plucks weeds is probably not going to make it in Africa before it makes it in the United States. It's just too costly. At the same time, coating seeds, coating produce itself, these are pretty inexpensive, approaches that I think can and should be adopted, not only in the United States, but in places where food waste is even more of a problem than it is here.
One of our listeners has asked about cultural values, and I think they're particularly thinking about the meat conversation we've had. So some people eat or don't eat meat for cultural reasons. And do you see a role that a sustainable food system has all of the above, or do you think we should be moving in one direction versus another?
Well, as I started off, talking about food is always dangerous because people do have different cultural perspectives on what should be eaten. And I guess, if, to be honest, that's what markets do. I mean, if indeed there is a market, as there is, say, in southern India for plant-based foods, that's what's going to get grown and eaten there. And in, will we, I think the alternative meat companies, particularly in the United States, are recognizing that there is this meat-loving part of some segment of our culture is that, and you're not going to change it necessarily. So how do you appeal to it in a way that provides an alternative that's more sustainable and more nutritious?
You mentioned that you heard from all of these innovators that you're interviewing a real concern about having strong intellectual property, which I totally get. And I was really thinking about that when I was reading the chapter on caribou biosciences, along with my colleagues here at ASU, and we're wondering, and this is not just about caribou biosciences, that is it's a genome editing sort of thing. You could describe it better than me, but how do we ensure that the wider use of these kind of technologies don't lead to, in this case, an even more concentrated seed industry, but in any of these cases, more concentration instead of fostering a more decentralized and competitive one? We know that President Biden has just come out with statements about monopolistic behavior in food and agriculture. Tom Vilsack, our Secretary of Agriculture, is talking about the need to have markets more competitive. Is this something that with these new innovators, we can see some change, or does it really require new laws, new regulations, new strategies?
Well, I mean, the amount of concentration of oligopolies, if you will, in the food and farm sector, as you well know, it's just massive. I mean, there are now 4 biotech companies that have increased their combined share of the corn seed market from 50% to 85%. You sort of go through almost every section, and it has become, big ag has become bigger, more concentrated, more oligopolistic. Some people would argue that that makes them slow moving because all they're largely doing is trying to consolidate and ensure that the status quo remains, and therefore opens up an opportunity for fast moving, agile entrepreneurs. The market will tell whether that's true or not. I think from the government perspective, I think innovators would say they're probably not overly optimistic that they're going to trust bust some of these companies, but they would surely like to ensure that there's not additional consolidation that goes on that makes it even harder for new entries to participate in markets.
So this is a university hosted function. What should we be doing differently in universities? What should I be doing differently as a professor in my research center to spark innovation in the food and agriculture sector that seems so long overdue?
I guess my bias is to talk with the entrepreneurs. I think that there is a natural sort of instinct, at least in some universities, to think about research that does minor little tweaks that might lead to some, minor little improvement. And that's not to dismiss them. I mean, obviously progress often results from a lot of minor little tweaks coming together. But I think there's the potential out there for massive disruption, and that universities, as well as NGOs and others, would be wise to be thinking outside the box, bringing in the entrepreneurs, finding out what they're thinking, their new world vision, because it's more than simply, small incremental changes. They're rethinking the way that we make proteins. They're rethinking the way we process, produce so that we reduce, food waste. They're across the board, there's sort of a rethinking that's going on. And universities, I would argue, that's their bailiwick, is to think and to rethink. And here is a real opportunity. But I would bring in the folks that are, in fact, working in this area and making that rethink a reality.
Cool. Well, I know a lot of universities are doing Shark Tank-like competitions as one way to spur innovation, but you're almost suggesting having entrepreneurs in residence, which is a common feature of a venture capital firm, for example.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think your analysis there is right on target. I mean, universities, you're not a venture capital firm, but you're pretty close. I mean, you're trying to train the next generation of engineers and marketers and investment bankers. And you need, as I'm sure you have, because you've got feet in both camps, the ability for the university to serve that role as an incubator for new talent.
one of our audience members asked whether you discuss any companies, I assume in your book then, working on improvements in soil microbiome to return to greater biodiversity.
Yeah, I mean, the one that I mentioned as far as they're doing the soil testing, they are also following up with, how do you coat seeds in such a way that the microbes better interact with the roots and bring nutrients, therefore, up to the plants. There are several that are thinking about how do you, the soil is unbelievably complex. I mean, the sort of joke is you get a teaspoon of soil and there's more, microbes in there than there are humans in the entire planet. So it's incredibly rich, although we've been horrible to it. But yes, there are people that are creatively thinking about fresh ways rather than dumping. The traditional way from big agriculture is you just come in with a chemical-based, fertilizer and spray the entire field. Well, the entire field is very different. I mean, there are some plants that are in a little bit of a gully where it's more soggy and need different nutrients than in other places of the field. And so I think one of the key things that's going on with farm innovation is rather than thinking about massive 1,000-acre fields, we're thinking about plants. And how do you make an individual plant do its best, for lack of a better word?
Well, one of the comments we see in the chat is about genetically modified organisms, and when you're referring to them as bad. But I don't think, I'm going to give you a moment to clarify, because some of your innovators in the book, including Impossible Foods, Pat Brown's innovation in the laboratory, does rely upon a sort of genetic engineering. So I don't think that your book is inclusive in terms of genome editing, genetic engineering, but let me throw that out to you. What are your thoughts?
Well, there's a, caribou bioscientists would create a distinction between bioengineering and bioediting. Or genetic editing, whereby it's an issue of whether you're introducing new species into the mix or simply editing an existing one. I mean, we have since the beginning of time, or human time, been messing around with plants to make them do what we want them to do. So, I mean, gene editing is nothing. It's almost natural because we've been doing it for so long. I mean, what Jennifer Doudna, who is the Nobel Prize winning biochemist who was featured in a recent biography, has done is create just a new technology called CRISPR that is able to do more editing, but gets away from the GMO label, which has become quite controversial. But the potential to edit or choose genes is something that we've been doing for just ages. It's just that the technology has gotten unbelievably fast. And I would argue that it's also, CRISPR technology is not one that is going to get limited to the big ag companies. This is something being done in thousands of universities and other places around the world. It's the democratizing technology that allows, startups around the world to be rethinking how they do create what they feel as better seeds.
Okay, last question. And
okay.
It's really coming from the very start of your presentation in your book. And you sort of said, what has made the soil fertile for this rise of innovators? And you say there are three factors that come together at the moment. Various technology advances like machine learning, visionaries and financiers who think they can outcompete big ag. And third, and that's really when to focus, the challenges of doubling food availability and slashing pollution. So I really looked at doubling food availability, and I thought that's a nice way of putting it, because so often people start food and agriculture meetings with statements such as, we need to increase food production by 70% by the year 2050. And it's always about increasing or doubling food production, but you actually use the words food availability. Can you explain the nuance there?
Well, I think big ag, industrialized ag is often criticized of using the population growth as an excuse for them to continue doing and in fact accelerating their industrialized ways. that I think only brings us additional malnutrition and additional environmental pollution. So I think the key issue, particularly noting that 40% of our food is lost because of waste, the potential to increase the availability of food, focusing on equity so that everybody has the chance to obtain an appropriate amount of nutritious food is really what we're trying to do. It's not that we necessarily have to produce more so we can waste more. We want to bring nutritious food sustainably to more people.
Perfect. Well, with that, we're at the end of our time. I do really want to thank you, Dick, for a really fascinating book for us all to read and for a great presentation this hour.
Thank you.
I know Lauren is putting a link in the chat to where you can buy your book from our Phoenix locally owned bookstore, beloved Changing Hands. I went there recently with my daughter. They have a little bar called First Draft, and with their menu, it's all puns. We loved it. So please, the book becomes available next Thursday. We hope you have an opportunity to take a look at it. And I just want to thank everybody for joining us today and for your great questions. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dick.
Thanks.